Where did my spleen go? I'd been getting annual x-rays for 5 years because of my job at the chemical plant, and they always came back normal. Then I slipped on some ice in my driveway and landed hard against the concrete steps. My wife drove me to urgent care thinking I'd probably cracked a rib or two, and they immediately sent me for x-rays to check for breaks. The tech positioned me against the machine and told me to hold still while she took images from different angles to get a complete view of my ribs and torso. I was sitting in the exam room waiting for the doctor to come tell me which ribs were broken, when instead, 3 different medical professionals walked in looking confused. The radiologist was holding my x-ray films and kept flipping between them like she was trying to solve a puzzle that made no sense. She asked me if I'd ever had abdominal surgery, and I told her no, because I'd never had any surgery at all except getting my wisdom teeth out. She asked again if I was absolutely certain I'd never had any kind of operation on my torso, and I said I was completely sure because I didn't even have any scars. The radiologist put my x-ray up on the light box and pointed to an area on the left side of my abdomen where she said my spleen should be visible. The space was completely empty with just normal tissue where the organ should have been sitting. She said spleens don't just disappear and asked if I had any medical conditions that might affect my organs. I told her I'd just had my annual screening 6 months ago, and everything had been totally normal, including my spleen, which was definitely there, and the right size. They pulled up my previous x-rays in their computer system, and there it was in last year's image exactly where it should be. The radiologist kept switching between the old image and the new one, and you could clearly see my spleen in one and absolutely nothing in the other. She called in the head of radiology, who looked at both images and immediately ordered a CT scan to get a better view. He kept asking if I'd been to any other hospitals or clinics recently, or if I'd had any procedures done that I might have forgotten about. The CT scan confirmed what the x-ray showed, which was that my spleen was completely gone without any sign of surgical removal. There were no scars on the inside of my abdomen, and all the blood vessels that should have connected to my spleen just ended in normal tissue like the organ had never existed. The surgeon they brought in for consultation said, "This is physically impossible because spleens don't spontaneously vanish, and even if someone had removed it, there would be clear evidence of the surgery." They ran blood tests to check if I had a functioning spleen somewhere else in my body that just wasn't showing up on imaging. The results showed that my blood had all the markers of someone who'd been living without a spleen for at least several months, even though my last blood work from 6 months ago showed normal spleen function. The hematologist said my white blood cell count and platelet levels were exactly what she'd expect to see in someone who'd had their spleen removed surgically, but she couldn't explain how that was possible. My wife was convinced the hospital had mixed up my x-rays with someone else's, but they ran the tests 3 more times with different machines and different technicians. Every single scan showed the same thing, which was absolutely no spleen where there should definitely be a spleen. They even brought in a portable ultrasound to check in real time, and the tech spent 20 minutes searching my entire abdomen without finding any trace of the organ. Word got around the hospital about my case, and doctors from different departments kept stopping by to look at my scans. One infectious disease specialist asked if I'd traveled anywhere unusual or been exposed to any rare parasites that might consume organ tissue. An oncologist wondered if I could have had a cancer that somehow dissolved the entire organ without leaving any trace. Every theory they came up with fell apart when they tried to explain how it could happen without symptoms or scarring. They started asking about my daily routines and any changes I'd made in the past year. I mentioned that I'd started taking new vitamins from this wellness clinic that Harper's friend recommended about 8 months ago. The doctors exchanged looks and asked for the bottle, but I'd thrown it away when I finished it. They asked if I remembered the name of the clinic, and when I told them, they all went silent, and one nurse actually left the room. After a week of tests, they discharged me with no answers and told me to come back immediately if I developed any symptoms. The radiologist pulled me aside before I left and said she'd been practicing medicine for 20 years and had never seen anything like this. She handed me a card with her personal cell phone number written on it. She said she'd sent my case to a colleague at Johns Hopkins who specialized in unexplained medical phenomena, and he wanted to fly me out for more testing. Then she showed me something on her phone that she said I needed to see. It was a medical journal article from 3 years ago about 7 different patients who'd all lost organs without explanation, and they all had one thing in common. And what I read made my entire body, or what was left of it, went cold. The article showed 7 patients from different states who'd all taken supplements from Wellness Collective clinics, and every single one had lost an organ without any surgical evidence. The radiologist scrolled down to show me the batch numbers, and they all started with WC47, just like she suspected mine would have. She folded the article printout 3 times and pressed it into my hand while writing down a phone number on the back with shaky handwriting. She told me this was Dr. Eleanor Pace at Johns Hopkins, and I needed to call her today because she'd been tracking these cases for 2 years. The radiologist kept glancing at the door like she was worried someone might walk in, and her voice dropped when she said the hospital administration didn't want staff discussing this pattern. She squeezed my shoulder and told me to be careful before walking out quickly. I stood there holding the paper and feeling like the floor might drop out from under me. My wife was sitting in her car in the parking lot scrolling through her phone when I opened the passenger door and collapsed into the seat. I tried to explain what the radiologist had shown me, but the words kept getting stuck in my throat. I handed her the article printout and watched her face change as she read through it. Her hands started shaking, and then she threw the car into reverse so fast I had to grab the door handle. She said we were going to that wellness clinic right now, and she was going to get answers from whoever was working there. I put my hand on her arm and told her we couldn't just show up there without a plan. She pulled over in the hospital parking lot and gripped the steering wheel while taking deep breaths. I explained that we needed to document everything first and contact this Hopkins specialist before we did anything else. She nodded, but I could see her jaw muscles working as she drove us home without saying another word. The house felt too quiet when we walked in, and I went straight to the filing cabinet where we kept our financial records. I pulled out 8 months of credit card statements and spread them across the kitchen table. There it was in black and white on the April statement, Wellness Collective for $89.95. My wife stood behind me, and we both stared at that line item like it might disappear if we looked away. She took a picture of it with her phone, and then I did the same because we both knew we'd need proof. I picked up my phone and dialed the number the radiologist had written down. It rang twice before a woman answered saying this was Dr. Pace, and she'd been expecting my call. Her voice was calm, but I could hear urgency underneath when she asked if I was the patient from the radiologist's referral. She said she'd been tracking organ disappearances linked to these supplements for 2 years, and my case might help her understand the pattern. She asked detailed questions about when I took the supplements and what other medications or chemicals I'd been exposed to. When I mentioned working at the chemical plant, she made a sound like pieces were clicking together in her head. She scheduled me for comprehensive testing next Tuesday and told me to overnight any remaining supplements if I had them. She gave me a FedEx account number and said to keep any receipts or bottles or anything related to the purchase. Before hanging up, she said this was bigger than just 7 cases and to avoid going back to that clinic until we knew more. That night, I lay in bed feeling weird sensations where my spleen used to be, even though the doctor said that was impossible. My wife reached over and took my hand without saying anything because we both knew how scared we were. Neither of us slept much, and I kept touching my left side expecting to feel something different. The next morning, I called my supervisor at the plant while my wife made coffee. I told him I needed extended medical leave for specialized treatment at Johns Hopkins. He sounded annoyed and started talking about quarterly targets and staffing issues. When I mentioned potential legal implications related to workplace chemical exposure, his tone changed completely. He approved the leave immediately and said HR would send the paperwork. After hanging up, I opened my laptop and searched for Wellness Collective online. Their website loaded slowly and showed dozens of 5-star reviews from 3 years ago, talking about miracle supplements and amazing energy boosts. But when I sorted by recent, there was nothing from the past 18 months. The last update on their blog was from 14 months ago, announcing new product lines. Their social media pages existed, but hadn't posted anything in almost a year. The clinic's hours showed they were open, but when I called the number, it just rang without anyone answering or even going to voicemail. I found their business registration online, and it was still active with an address about 20 minutes from our house. My wife looked over my shoulder as I searched and pointed out that all the positive reviews stopped right around when the medical journal article was published. She clicked on a health forum link near the bottom of the search results and started scrolling through posts from people asking about weird side effects from vitamins. Most of the posts were typical stuff about upset stomachs or headaches, but then she stopped scrolling and pointed at one from 3 months ago. The title said, "Missing kidney after taking Wellness Collective supplements. Anyone else?" And the username was JC Crawford87. I clicked on the post and started reading about this guy, Justin Crawford, who went in for back pain and found out his left kidney was completely gone. He described the same confusion from doctors and the same lack of surgical scars and how he'd taken supplements from the same clinic 8 months before his kidney vanished. My wife grabbed the laptop and started typing a private message to him, explaining our situation and asking if he wanted to compare notes. She hit send before I could even finish reading his whole post, and we both stared at the screen waiting for any sign he was online. About 40 minutes later, the message icon lit up, and there was his reply saying he couldn't believe someone else was going through this. He gave me his phone number and said to call immediately because his wife, Chelsea, had been keeping track of other cases. He mentioned they'd found 4 more people so far who all had different organs missing after taking those supplements. I dialed his number, and he answered on the first ring sounding desperate to talk to someone who'd believe him. He told me Chelsea had spreadsheets and medical records and emails from other victims, and they'd been trying to find patterns for months. He said she'd call me in a few hours after she got home from work because she understood the medical stuff better than him. Sure enough, Chelsea called that afternoon, and her voice was all business like she'd been preparing for this conversation. She explained they had an informal network of 6 people, including Justin, who'd all lost different organs after taking supplements from Wellness Collective. She rattled off the list, which included a woman missing her gallbladder, and a man whose adrenal gland had vanished, and another person missing part of their liver. The thing that connected everyone was the batch numbers on their supplement bottles all started with the same code. She said every single person had a batch number beginning with WC47, followed by a letter. She asked if I still had my receipt or any record of what batch I'd purchased. I told her to hold on while I dug through the filing cabinet where my wife keeps all our receipts and credit card statements. My fingers were shaking as I flipped through the folder from 8 months ago, looking for anything from the wellness clinic. There it was stapled to the credit card statement with the itemized receipt showing the supplement name and price. At the bottom, in small print, was the batch number, and my stomach dropped when I saw WC47B printed clearly on the paper. I told Chelsea what I'd found, and she made a sound like she'd expected it, but hoped she was wrong. She said this proved we weren't random victims, but specifically targeted by certain batches of supplements. She asked me to scan the receipt and email it to her, so she could add it to her evidence file. Right after I hung up, my phone buzzed with a text from Harper, asking why I'd been out sick for over a week. I stared at the message knowing I had to tell him that his friend's recommendation had led to my spleen disappearing. I texted back that we needed to talk in person and asked if he could meet for coffee the next morning. He agreed and asked if everything was okay, but I didn't know how to answer that in a text. The next morning, I sat in the coffee shop waiting for Harper and trying to figure out how to explain everything. He walked in looking concerned and sat down asking what was going on with me. I started from the beginning with the fall on the ice and the x-rays and watched his face go from confused to shocked as I explained about my missing spleen. When I got to the part about the wellness clinic supplements, his skin went pale and he grabbed his phone. He called his friend right there in the coffee shop demanding to know why they'd recommended that clinic. I could hear his friend on the other end claiming they'd just seen an ad online and thought it looked good. Harper kept pressing for more information, but his friend insisted they didn't know anything about problems with the supplements. After he hung up, Harper apologized over and over, saying he never would have mentioned it if he'd known. 3 days later, my appointment at Johns Hopkins finally arrived, and my wife drove us to Baltimore at 5 in the morning. I spent the drive reviewing all my medical records and making notes about dates and symptoms and anything that might help. The GPS led us through the hospital campus to a research building where Dr. Eleanor Pace had her office on the 4th floor. Her office walls were covered with charts and graphs and medical journal articles, all connected with colored string like a detective's evidence board. She had stacks of patient files on her desk and a whiteboard filled with chemical formulas I didn't understand. She shook my hand and immediately started asking questions while pulling up my files on her computer. She ordered blood work first and sent me to a lab down the hall where they took 12 vials of blood. Then she had me go through a series of scans using machines I'd never seen before that looked way more advanced than anything at our local hospital. She explained she was checking for trace elements and biological markers that normal tests wouldn't detect. The way she moved through the tests suggested she'd done this exact series many times before with other patients. She kept making notes on her tablet and occasionally nodding like pieces were fitting together in her mind. 2 hours later, she called me back to her office with a thick folder of test results. The blood work showed elevated levels of iron and copper and some rare metals that shouldn't be in my system at all. She pulled up a molecular diagram on her computer showing how these metals could bond with organic compounds to create nanoparticles. She explained that at certain concentrations, these particles could theoretically target specific organs based on their chemical signatures. She said my spleen would have filtered these particles initially, but once they reached a critical mass, they could have triggered a breakdown of the organ tissue itself. She started asking detailed questions about my job at the chemical plant and what compounds I worked with daily. She wanted to know about every chemical exposure and safety protocol and whether I'd noticed any changes in my health before taking the supplements. She pulled out a map of the United States and started marking locations where other victims lived and worked. She pointed out that 3 of us worked in chemical or industrial settings with regular exposure to certain compounds. She said the supplements alone might not cause organ loss, but combined with specific occupational exposures, they could trigger the process. Her theory was that certain chemicals at my job made my body more susceptible to whatever was in those supplements. She pulled out a folder with vaccination schedules and started marking which ones I'd need right away, since my spleen couldn't protect me from certain bacteria anymore. The nurse came in with a tray of syringes and explained I'd need pneumonia vaccines and meningitis shots and something for Haemophilus influenzae, which I'd never even heard of before. She stuck me with 4 different needles while listing all the things I'd have to watch out for now, like avoiding sick people and taking antibiotics before any dental work and getting to a hospital fast if I ever got a fever over 101. The shots burned going in and my arms started aching, but what really hurt was hearing her say, this would be my life forever now, with booster shots every few years and constant worry about infections that normal people fight off without even knowing. Dr. Pace gave me a thick packet of information about living without a spleen and scheduled another appointment in 2 weeks to check my antibody levels. Back at our hotel that night, I called Justin Crawford and told him everything Dr. Pace had discovered about the metal compounds and nanoparticles. He got excited and said Chelsea had been organizing all their medical records into a timeline, and they wanted to share everything with Dr. Pace to help build the case. Chelsea got on the phone and rattled off dates and test results and batch numbers while I took notes on hotel stationery. She'd found 2 more people through online forums who'd taken the same supplements and lost organs, and she was putting together what looked more like evidence for a crime than just medical research. We set up a shared folder online where we could all upload our records and lab results and anything else that might help Dr. Pace understand the pattern. The next morning, my wife and I drove back home, and I couldn't stop thinking about that wellness clinic that sold me those supplements. I looked up the address online and saw they were still open according to their website, even though the reviews had stopped months ago. My wife didn't want me going there, but I needed to see the place and maybe get answers about what they'd sold me. The clinic was in a strip mall between a nail salon and a tax office, and when I walked in, the waiting room was almost empty, except for one older woman reading a magazine. The receptionist looked up from her computer, and her smile disappeared when I said I'd taken supplements from them last year and had questions. She started typing fast on her keyboard and said they'd discontinued that product line months ago due to supplier issues. I asked what kind of supplier issues, and she got nervous and said she wasn't allowed to discuss product details, and maybe I should talk to the director. She picked up her desk phone and whispered something I couldn't hear, and then told me to wait. A few minutes later, a man in an expensive suit came out and introduced himself as Aldo Molina, the clinic director. He had perfect white teeth and shook my hand too hard, and immediately started asking what concerns I had about their products. I told him about my missing spleen and the metal compounds in my blood, and watched his face stay perfectly calm like he'd practiced this conversation before. He said their products were all FDA-approved supplements, and suggested maybe I had some underlying health condition that caused my problems. When I mentioned other people losing organs after taking the same batch, he said that was impossible, and started talking about lawyers and defamation, and how I better be careful making accusations without proof. I noticed his eyes kept moving to the security cameras in the corners of the ceiling, and realized he was making sure our whole conversation was recorded. He handed me his business card and said to have my lawyer contact their legal department if I had any real concerns. But the way he stood with his arms crossed told me he knew exactly what those supplements had done. His defensive posture and the way he kept mentioning lawyers made it clear he'd been expecting people like me to show up asking questions. That evening, my wife spread out all our bills and bank statements on the kitchen table and started adding up medical costs and lost wages from my time off work. The numbers made my stomach hurt worse than the vaccination shots, with thousands in medical bills already, and more coming with all the follow-up care I'd need. She grabbed my hand and said we'd figure it out together, and my health was more important than money, and we could sell the boat if we had to, or take out a loan against the house. I posted on 3 different local Facebook groups and 2 community message boards, asking if anyone else had weird health problems after taking supplements from that wellness clinic. Within 2 hours, I had 4 private messages, and by the next morning, 2 more people had reached out with stories about unexplained symptoms and missing tissue on their scans. One woman said her thyroid had shrunk to almost nothing, and another guy's pancreas was only working at half capacity, and they'd both taken supplements from the same batch numbers Chelsea had been tracking. I set up a video call with Justin that afternoon, and he looked tired but determined on my laptop screen. He told me he'd been emailing with someone in Germany who'd lost their gallbladder after taking similar supplements from a different brand, but with the same weird metal signatures in their blood work. This wasn't just our local clinic, but something bigger and international with the same formula being sold under different names in different countries. Dr. Pace called that evening and said her preliminary analysis suggested the supplements contained engineered nanoparticles specifically designed to accumulate in certain organs until they reached a critical mass. Once enough particles built up, they basically dissolved the organ tissue from inside without leaving any surgical traces or scarring. She was working with colleagues at 3 other universities, trying to understand why only some people were affected, and her current theory involved specific genetic markers combined with environmental triggers. My job at the chemical plant with all those industrial compounds might have been the exact trigger that activated the nanoparticles in my system, while someone else taking the same supplements might not have the right combination of factors. 3 days later, my phone buzzed with a notification from an encrypted messaging app I didn't even know I had installed. The message came from someone named Kara Nicholson, who said she worked at the wellness clinic and had information about what they'd been doing, but needed protection before she could share anything. She said she'd been watching what happened to customers for months and couldn't stay quiet anymore, but was scared of what Molina might do if he found out she was talking. I typed back that I'd meet her anywhere she felt safe, and she suggested a coffee shop 40 minutes away where nobody from the clinic would see us. That same afternoon, my work called, and the HR representative said I needed to either return to my position immediately or provide more detailed medical documentation within 48 hours. The way she talked made it clear they were getting impatient with my extended absence and didn't care that I was dealing with a missing organ and all the health problems that came with it. She reminded me that I'd already used up most of my sick leave, and if I didn't have proper documentation, they'd have to start disciplinary proceedings. The next morning, my supervisor called directly and said they needed me back for mandatory overtime because they had a big order to fill and were short-staffed. I told him I couldn't work around chemicals anymore without my spleen to filter toxins, and he got quiet before saying that was my choice, but refusing mandatory overtime would result in a write-up. 20 minutes later, I got an email with the official disciplinary notice attached, saying my refusal to work assigned shifts could affect my annual review and potential for advancement. I forwarded everything to my wife, who called me immediately saying we should get a lawyer, but I was too focused on meeting Kara to deal with work drama right then. Kara showed up at the coffee shop carrying a thick manila envelope and looking around nervously every few seconds. She slid the envelope across the table and told me to look at the documents inside, but not to react too much because she didn't know if anyone was watching. The first page showed internal emails between Molina and someone at a pharmaceutical research company discussing different formulations of what they called targeted dissolution compounds, with specific batch numbers assigned to each variation. The emails talked about tracking which organs each batch affected and how long the process took from initial consumption to complete dissolution. There were spreadsheets showing customer names matched with batch numbers and expected outcomes with notes about which combinations worked best for different organ systems. One column tracked successful dissolutions, with check marks next to names and dates when customers reported health changes or stopped coming back to the clinic. Kara pointed to a section highlighting how they deliberately marketed these compounds as natural supplements to avoid FDA oversight while knowing exactly what they would do to people's bodies. The next set of documents made my hands shake because they were actual purchase orders from a laboratory supply company with bright red stamps saying, "Not for human consumption, research use only," across every page. Melina's signature appeared on each order, along with his handwritten notes about which batches to label as which vitamin supplements for retail sale. The invoices showed he'd been buying these compounds for 3 years, and the quantities kept increasing as they figured out which formulations worked most effectively. Kara had photocopied everything, including credit card statements, showing the clinic paid premium prices for expedited shipping on these research chemicals. She told me she'd started collecting evidence 6 months ago when she noticed customers coming back with strange symptoms and Melina telling her to stop asking questions about it. That evening, I called Dr. Pace and told her about the documents, and she said this was exactly the evidence she needed for the Institutional Review Board. She explained that having documented proof of intentional harm would fast-track the formal research approval and make it impossible for the clinic to claim coincidence or user error. She submitted our case series that night with all the supporting documentation and said the board would review it within days given the severity of the situation. 2 days later, I woke up with a fever of 102, and my wife drove me straight to urgent care, where they took one look at my medical history and immediately started me on intravenous antibiotics. The doctor explained that without a spleen, even a minor infection could turn life-threatening within hours, and they weren't taking any chances with my symptoms. They kept me for 6 hours running tests and monitoring my vital signs before releasing me with 3 different prescriptions and strict instructions to return if my fever went above 101 again. That night, my wife sat on the edge of our bed crying and saying she was scared of losing me to something as simple as a cold now that my immune system was compromised. She held my hand and said she'd been reading about people dying from infections that normal immune systems would fight off easily, and she couldn't stop thinking about all the ways I could get sick now. We stayed up talking about how to balance investigating what happened with keeping me healthy and agreed that my health had to come first, no matter how much we wanted answers. The next morning, I filed a formal FDA MedWatch report online detailing my timeline from taking the supplements to discovering my missing spleen, with all the batch numbers and purchase dates included. Within 3 days, Marcel Cho from the FDA called saying they'd received my report, along with several others about the same clinic, and were opening a formal investigation. He asked detailed questions about everything from the supplement packaging to my symptoms and said they'd be contacting me for additional information as they built their case. That afternoon, my phone rang showing a number I didn't recognize, and when I answered, Melina's voice came through loud and angry, saying I was spreading lies about his business, and if I didn't stop immediately, he'd sue me for defamation. His voice shook with rage as he threatened to take everything I owned and destroy my reputation, but underneath the anger, I could hear fear creeping through. I hung up on him and blocked his number, but my hands were shaking, so bad I could barely hold the phone. Kara texted me an hour later asking to meet at a coffee shop downtown because she had something important to give me. I drove there wondering if this was some kind of trap, but when I walked in, she was sitting alone in the back corner looking nervous. She slid a small padded envelope across the table and told me to put it in my pocket right away without looking inside. Her eyes kept darting to the door like she expected someone to walk in any second. She whispered that it was a sealed vial from the exact same batch I took 8 months ago. She'd saved it when she started noticing weird things happening at the clinic and thought someone should test what was really in those supplements. I asked why she was helping me, and she said she couldn't sleep at night knowing what they'd done to people. She left first and told me to wait 10 minutes before following, so nobody would see us together. I drove straight to Hopkins with the vial hidden in my jacket pocket and called Dr. Pace from the parking lot. She met me at the lab entrance and took the vial directly to someone named Quentin Herrera, who ran their advanced testing facility. He handled it with thick gloves and put it in a sealed container before starting his analysis. We waited in Dr. Pace's office while he worked, and she showed me emails from other doctors reporting similar cases. 3 hours later, Quentin came back with printouts showing chemical structures I didn't understand. He explained the vial contained iron nanoparticles coated with something called polyethylene glycol and bonded to plant extracts. The chemistry was way more complex than anything that should be in natural vitamins. He said whoever made this knew exactly what they were doing because the coating would let the particles pass through stomach acid unchanged. Dr. Pace studied the results, and her face got more serious with each page she read. She explained the nanoparticles were designed to accumulate in organs that filter blood like the spleen and liver. Once enough built up, they would basically overwhelm the organ's filtering system and cause it to shut down slowly over months. The process was gradual enough that my body had time to adapt, which is why I never felt really sick. She said my spleen probably started failing 6 months ago and just slowly disappeared as the tissue broke down. The radiologist from my hospital called that afternoon, saying Dr. Pace had sent her the lab results. She pulled up my old x-rays on her computer and looked at them with this new information. She pointed to areas around where my spleen used to be and showed me subtle density changes she hadn't noticed before. The tissue was slightly darker in each scan, showing the nanoparticles building up over time. The evidence had been right there in every x-ray, but too subtle to spot without knowing what to look for. She made copies of everything and said she was adding it to the case file she was building. Marcel Cho from the FDA called the next morning, saying he needed to schedule a formal interview immediately. He explained they'd gotten multiple reports about the wellness clinic and were moving toward criminal charges. The interview would be recorded and used as evidence if the case went to trial. He gave me the address of a federal building downtown and said to bring any documentation I had. My phone rang right after, and it was HR from the chemical plant demanding I provide fitness for duty paperwork before returning to work. They said even desk duty required medical clearance now that I had a documented organ loss. We went back and forth about accommodations and finally agreed on flexible hours for medical appointments. They also promised to keep me away from any chemical exposure areas permanently. That night, I found an online support group for people living without spleens and spent hours reading their posts. They shared tips about avoiding crowds during flu season and which vaccines were most important to get. One person wrote about carrying antibiotics everywhere, and another explained which foods helped boost immune function. It felt weird but good to connect with people dealing with the same daily challenges I was facing. Dr. Pace called asking if I'd be willing to be the lead case in her medical journal article about supplement-induced organ loss. She said having a documented case with lab evidence would help warn other doctors to look for this. Being the face of this whole thing felt scary, but also gave me purpose beyond just being a victim. I told her yes, and she started drafting the paper that same day. 2 days later, I drove to the wellness clinic with Kara parked across the street in her car. She had her phone ready to record from her window while I went inside to confront Molina with the lab results. He was in his office, and his face went red when he saw me walk through the door. I put the lab report on his desk and watched him scan through it while his jaw clenched tighter with each page. He started with denial, saying the tests must be wrong, and then shifted to blaming customers for not following directions. He said people took too much or mixed it with other supplements, and that wasn't his fault. Not once did he ask if I was okay or express any concern about my health or anyone else's. His voice got louder as he insisted he'd done nothing illegal and threatened to call security if I didn't leave. I pushed him harder, asking why he kept selling after getting reports of problems, and that's when he snapped. He stood up and said something about acceptable losses and needing to maximize profit before regulators caught on. He said the real money was in the first year before the FDA started sniffing around, and after that you just moved on to the next product. Kara got the whole thing on video from her car, including him admitting he knew about problems early on. Dr. Pace called me that evening and told me to stay away from the clinic now that we had evidence because the FDA was building an enforcement case, but there were bigger financial players involved than just Molina who wouldn't want this exposed. She explained that supplement companies had major investors who stood to lose millions if this scandal went public, and some of them had connections to people who could make problems for whistleblowers. I asked what kind of problems, and she just said to be careful and document everything, but avoid direct confrontation from now on. 3 days later, Marcel Cho from the FDA scheduled my formal interview at the federal building downtown, and I spent 4 hours going through every detail of my timeline while he typed notes on his laptop. He kept asking me to repeat certain parts, and his face got more disturbed each time I described finding out about the batch numbers and Molina's knowledge of the problems. He showed me reports from other victims he'd interviewed, and the patterns were all the same, with organs disappearing after taking supplements from specific batches. Marcel said the deliberate targeting made this different from typical contamination cases and might involve criminal charges, not just civil penalties. After the interview, my supervisor called me into his office at the chemical plant and offered me a permanent desk position reviewing safety protocols with a 20% pay cut, but better health insurance coverage. The timing felt weird, but he said they'd been planning to create this role anyway, and my situation made me the obvious choice since I couldn't work near chemicals anymore. I took the job because we needed stable income, and the insurance would cover my ongoing medical monitoring, which was going to be expensive for the rest of my life. That same week, I drove past the wellness clinic and saw a big sign saying they were closed for renovations and would reopen soon with new management. The local news ran a brief story about the business closure, but framed it as part of normal turnover in the strip mall without mentioning any health concerns or investigations. I called Marcel about it, and he said they couldn't stop the clinic from closing voluntarily, but it might actually help the investigation if Molina thought he was getting away with it. Dr. Pace emailed me amazing news that her research paper about supplement-induced organ loss had been accepted by the New England Journal of Medicine, and she'd listed me as a contributing author. She said having my case documented in a major medical journal would help other doctors recognize this condition and maybe save lives even if we couldn't get our organs back. The publication was still months away, but it felt like the first real victory in this whole nightmare. Kara called me crying because she'd quit the clinic after giving her evidence to the FDA and now couldn't find work since potential employers kept asking why she left her last job so suddenly. I remembered the hospital HR department was hiring for administrative positions and connected her with the recruitment manager who'd helped process my medical leave paperwork. She got an interview the next week, and they hired her for a records management position that paid less than the clinic, but at least didn't involve poisoning people. My wife and I met with a financial counselor at our credit union who helped us restructure our budget around my reduced income and the medical expenses we'd be dealing with forever. We had to cancel our vacation plans and sell my truck to pay down debt, but the numbers worked if we were careful, and nothing else went catastrophically wrong with my health. The counselor said lots of families dealt with chronic medical conditions and gave us worksheets for tracking expenses and planning for emergencies. I went to the clinic 3 times that month to complete my vaccination series, since people without spleens need extra protection against certain bacteria that normal immune systems handle automatically. The nurse taught me how to recognize early infection signs and gave me an emergency antibiotic prescription to carry everywhere in case I got sick when I couldn't reach a doctor immediately. These little adaptations were becoming routine now, with my wallet full of medical alert cards and emergency contact numbers instead of the normal stuff I used to carry. The chemical plant announced a company-wide safety audit that my supervisor swore wasn't related to my case, but the timing seemed suspicious since they'd never done one before in my 5 years there. They brought in outside consultants who recommended better protective equipment and stricter protocols for chemical exposure, which would help future workers even if it was too late for me. The new safety measures included regular organ function screening, which definitely wasn't a coincidence, but at least something good might come from what happened to me. 2 weeks later, Marcel called to tell me the FDA had issued a public safety alert about supplements from certain batch numbers, without naming the wellness clinic directly yet. The alert warned consumers to stop taking any supplements with batch codes starting with WC47 and to seek medical attention if they experienced unexplained symptoms. It felt like progress, even though the vague language frustrated me, since people needed to know exactly which clinic had poisoned them, not just which batch numbers to avoid. Marcel explained they had to follow specific legal procedures before naming companies publicly, but promised more comprehensive warnings were coming once they finished documenting all the evidence. The alert was buried on the FDA website where most people would never see it, but at least it existed as an official acknowledgement that something dangerous had happened with those supplements. 3 weeks later, Dr. Pace called with news that her research proposal had been approved for a major grant studying how these supplements caused organ damage and what treatments might help victims like me. She promised to send updates whenever they made progress, and said our group's medical data was already helping them understand the mechanism better. The money from the grant would fund testing for prevention methods, and maybe even ways to detect damage before organs completely disappeared. That same week, I finally signed the paperwork accepting the desk position at the chemical plant after my supervisor made it clear I couldn't return to my old job without full medical clearance. The pay cut hurt, but having steady health insurance mattered more now, and my coworkers were being really supportive about the whole situation. They moved my desk away from the production areas where chemical fumes might drift and gave me flexible hours for all my medical appointments. The reduced exposure to chemicals was probably better for my health anyway, considering what had already happened to my body. A few days later, Kara sent me a message through the encrypted app saying she'd gotten the hospital job and wanted to thank me for the reference. She wrote that she finally felt safe at work, without worrying about what she was selling to people, or whether her boss was breaking laws. Knowing she'd escaped that toxic environment and found something better made the whole mess feel like it had at least helped someone, besides just exposing the clinic. The radiologist who first discovered my missing spleen called to tell me she'd been invited to present our case at a big medical conference next month. She wanted my permission to use my scans and test results in her presentation, and said she'd been telling colleagues how brave I was for pursuing answers when most people would have just accepted the mystery. Her presentation would reach hundreds of doctors who might recognize similar cases in their own practices and know to look for supplement connections. My wife surprised me that Friday by packing our bags and driving us to a lake cabin she'd rented for the weekend. We hadn't taken any kind of vacation since this whole thing started, and she said we both needed to get away from hospitals and lawyers and medical tests for a couple days. We were careful about crowds and brought hand sanitizer everywhere, but just being together somewhere quiet felt like the first step toward normal life again. The lake was peaceful, and we spent most of the time reading on the deck and cooking simple meals without talking about organs or lawsuits or medical bills. 6 months after discovering my spleen was gone, I went back to see Dr. Pace for my follow-up appointment. She ran a full set of scans checking every organ and confirmed nothing else had disappeared or shown signs of damage since we'd stopped the supplements. The blood work showed my body had adjusted to functioning without a spleen, and as long as I stayed careful about infections, my long-term outlook was actually pretty good. She wanted to keep monitoring me every year just to be safe, but said the immediate danger seemed to have passed once we identified and stopped the source. That night, I sat at my computer and started typing up our whole story from the beginning with every detail I could remember. I posted it on health forums and consumer protection websites and anywhere else people might search for information about weird symptoms or supplement safety. The post included the clinic name and batch numbers and warning signs to watch for and links to the FDA alerts that were still buried on government websites. Within days, hundreds of people had shared it, and dozens messaged me with their own stories of unexplained health problems after taking supplements from similar clinics. Some had lost organs like me, while others had different kinds of damage, but all of them felt relieved to finally have an explanation for what had happened to their bodies. Looking back at everything from that first x-ray to now, I'd lost my spleen and a chunk of my income, and any sense that the world was safe or fair. But I'd also found this whole network of people fighting the same fight, including doctors who believed us, and investigators who took us seriously, and other victims who understood what we were going through. Marcel kept pushing the FDA case forward, and Dr. Pace kept researching treatments, and Kara kept sharing evidence, and the radiologist kept spreading awareness at medical conferences. My body would never be the same, and I'd spend the rest of my life being careful about germs and infections that normal people never worried about. But I wasn't facing it alone anymore, and it helped expose something that might have hurt thousands more people if we'd stayed quiet. The support from everyone who'd stepped up to help made the loss bearable, and gave me hope that maybe we could stop this from happening to anyone else. That's a wrap for now. Thanks for just hanging out and exploring all these little details with me. Until next time, subscribe for more content like this.